GX.
With the Tsavo bridge finished and the shadow of the man-eaters lifted from the valley, a new chapter began for Lieutenant Colonel Patterson. The daily routine of engineering was now interspersed with opportunities for exploration, forays into the vast, unknown wilderness that stretched away in every direction from the thin iron line of the railway. He was drawn to the mysteries of the land, to the rugged hills and hidden valleys that had, until now, been the sole domain of wild beasts and a few wandering tribesmen. It was during these expeditions that he would stumble upon the final, grisly secret of the lions he had slain and face new dangers that were every bit as terrifying. One morning, after breakfast, Patterson struck out from his camp towards the Ndungu escarpment, a frowning, rugged ridge that ran for a great distance parallel to the Sabaki River. He was accompanied by his usual retinue, his cook Mabruki, his gun-bearer Mahina, and a few local Wakamba tribesmen he had hired for the journey. They had not gone very far before he caught sight of a fine water buck. A single, well-placed shot brought the handsome antelope down, a good omen for the day that put everyone in excellent spirits. As they prepared the animal, Mabruki, who was a great glutton, cut off several strips of the tough meat and impaled them on a sharp stick to dry in the sun as he walked along. Patterson, knowing his cook's timid nature, decided to have some fun with him. He warned him gravely that he had better be careful that a lion did not scent the meat, for if it did, it would be sure to follow up and kill him. Though meant in jest, the warning struck a chord of fear in the nervous cook. As they trudged on towards the hills, Patterson heard a peculiar noise behind a small rise to their right. Peering over the crest, he was delighted to see a sight of rare and tranquil beauty. Two beautiful, full-grown giraffes were feeding peacefully a little distance away, straining their impossibly long necks to get at the tender top leaves of some mimosa-like trees. Close by, almost at his feet, a young one was lying down in the grass. For some time Patterson remained concealed, watching the magnificent pair with great interest. They seemed to be on the most affectionate terms, occasionally entwining their great long necks and gently biting each other on the shoulders. Much as he would have liked to have added a giraffe to his collection of trophies, he could not bring himself to disturb the peaceful scene. He considered it a pity to shoot these rare and harmless creatures, unless one was required for a very special purpose. They pushed on, accordingly, towards the escarpment, Patterson now impatient to get to the top and explore a place where he felt convinced no other white man had ever set foot. The climb up the escarpment itself was a stiff one, much of it negotiated on all fours, but upon reaching the summit they were rewarded with a magnificent panorama. The valley of the Tsavo lay spread out like a map some 500 feet below them. Their home tents, the new bridge, Tsavo station, and other buildings were plainly visible, and the railway itself, like a shining snake, could be seen for many miles winding its way through the parched wilderness. Having taken in the view, they turned and struck inland, across the Ndungu Plateau. Here they found the same kind of thorny nyika as that around Tsavo, but the country was somewhat more open and was intersected by hundreds of broad and well-beaten animal paths, which made for easy walking. Patterson was leading the way, followed closely by Mahina and the nervous Mabruki, when suddenly they almost walked right upon a lion. It was lying down at the side of the path, probably asleep, and at their sudden appearance, it gave a fierce growl and at once bounded off through the bush. The incident so alarmed poor Mabruki, who doubtless recalled the warning Patterson had given him in jest earlier in the day, that he flung down his stickload of meat and fled for his life, much to the amusement of the others, even the usually silent Wakamba joining in the general laughter as they scrambled for the discarded prize. They saw nothing more of the lion, though a few steps further on they found the remains of a zebra he had recently killed. After that, Mabruki kept carefully to the rear of the party. Curiously enough, only a short while later, they had an almost identical adventure with a rhinoceros. Owing to the tortuous nature of the path, they walked right into it before they were aware. Like the lion, however, the great beast was more frightened than they were, and it charged away from them, crashing through the jungle like a runaway locomotive. For about 2 hours they pursued their journey across the plateau, seeing a wonderful variety of game, including more giraffe, rhino, bushbuck, the lesser kudu, and warthog. but they saw no signs of human habitation. The whole region was so dry and waterless as to be quite uninhabitable. The animals that required water had to make a nightly journey of many miles to and from the Sabaki River, which accounted for the thousands of animal paths leading from the plateau to the river. By this time, the party was beginning to feel very tired, and the beastie's stock of water was running low. Patterson climbed the highest tree he could find to get a good look around, but in every direction he could see nothing but the same flat, thorny wilderness. There was not a landmark of any sort or kind as far as the eye could reach. It was, he realized, a most hopeless, terrible place to be lost in, with certain death by either thirst or savage beasts staring one in the face. Clearly, the only thing to do was to return to the river, and to do so before dark, they had to start at once. But they had been winding in and out so much through the animal paths that it was no easy matter to say in which direction the Sabaki lay. Patterson first consulted his Wakamba followers, but they simply shook their heads. He then asked Mahina, who pointed in a direction exactly opposite to that which Patterson felt confident was the right one. Mabruki, of course, knew nothing, but volunteered the helpful and cheering information that they were all lost and would all be killed by lions. In these circumstances, Patterson relied on his own judgment. By comparing his watch with the position of the sun, he confirmed his own idea as to their way, and gave the order to start at once. For 2 solid hours, however, they trudged along in the fearful heat, without striking a single familiar object or landmark. Mabruki murmured loudly. Even Mahina expressed grave doubts as to whether the sahib had taken the right direction. For some time they had been following a broad white rhino path, and the great footmarks of one of these beasts were fresh and plainly visible in the dust. The rhino had been traveling in the opposite direction to them, and Patterson felt sure that it must have been returning from drinking in the river. He accordingly insisted on their keeping to this path, and very soon, to his immense relief, they found that they were at the edge of the escarpment, a couple of miles away from the place where they had made the ascent. After a short rest and a meal, they pushed on with renewed vigor, and arrived at the Sabaki River in good time before sundown. After the long and fatiguing day, Patterson's bathe in a clear, shady pool was a real delight. It was a pleasure he might not have enjoyed quite so much, however, if he had known of the terrible fate which was to befall one of his followers in that same river the very next day. At dawn, the party made a start on their return journey to Tsavo. They were following the Maasai trail along the river's bank when one of the Wakamba went down to the water's edge to fill his calabash. Suddenly, a huge crocodile rose up out of the stream, seized the poor fellow, and in a moment had dragged him under. Patterson was ahead at the time and did not witness the attack, but on hearing the cries of the others, he ran back as quickly as possible. He was too late. He saw no sign of either the crocodile or the native. Mahina, ever the pragmatist, philosophically remarked that after all, it was only a Washenzi, a savage, whose loss did not much matter. The other 3 Wakamba certainly did not appear to be greatly affected by the incident. They calmly possessed themselves of their dead companion's bow and quiver of poisoned arrows, and of the stock of meat which he had left on the bank. Patterson had since learned that accidents of this kind were fairly frequent along the banks of these rivers. The wilds had a way of constantly reminding one of the thin veil that separated life from a sudden, violent death. It was some time after this expedition that Patterson finally stumbled upon the last great secret of the Tsavo man-eaters. On a day when work had been stopped due to a lack of materials, he set off to explore some rocky-looking hills that lay to the southwest of his camp. He was accompanied by Mahina and a Punjabi coolie who was so stout that he went by the name of Muta, meaning fatty. They were fortunate enough to find a rhino path leading in the right direction, which greatly facilitated their progress. As they were making their way along this path through the dry bed of a gully, or nullah, Patterson happened to notice that the sandy bottom sparkled here and there where the sunbeams penetrated the dense foliage. This at once filled his head with thoughts of precious stones. The spot looked likely enough, so he started to dig vigorously at the gravel with his hunting knife. After a few minutes of this work, he came across what he at first took to be a magnificent diamond sparkling in the damp sand. It was about half an inch long, and its facets looked as if they had been cut by an Amsterdam expert. He tested the stone on his watch glass and found that it cut his initials quite easily. For a moment or two, he was greatly delighted with his discovery and began to have rosy dreams of a diamond mine. But on closer examination and testing, he was forced to the conclusion that his find was not a diamond, though it was unlike any other mineral he had ever come across. His hopes of rapidly becoming a millionaire having thus been dashed to the ground, they proceeded on their way, getting further and further into the depths of a gloomy forest. As he followed up the main ravine, walking stealthily along in the delightful shade of the overhanging palms, he noticed on his left a little nullah, which opened out of the main channel through a confused mass of jungle and creeper. Through this tangle there was a well-defined archway, doubtless made by the regular passage of rhino and hippo. So he decided to enter and explore what lay beyond. He had not gone very far when he came upon a big bay, scooped out of the bank by the stream when in flood and carpeted with a deposit of fine, soft sand, in which were the indistinct tracks of numberless animals. In one corner of this bay, close under an overhanging tree, stood a little sandy hillock. On looking over the top of this, he saw on the other side a fearsome-looking cave, which seemed to run back for a considerable distance under the rocky bank. And there, around the entrance and inside the cavern, he was thunderstruck to find a number of human bones, with here and there a copper bangle such as the natives wear. Beyond all doubt, it was the man-eater's den. In this manner, and quite by accident, he had stumbled upon the lair of those once dreaded demons, the very place he had spent so many weary days searching for during the time when they terrorized Tsavo. He had no inclination to explore the gloomy depths of the interior, but thinking that there might possibly still be a lioness or cubs inside, he fired a shot or two into the cavern through a hole in the roof. Save for a disturbed swarm of bats, nothing came out. After taking a photograph of the cave, he gladly left the horrible spot, thankful that the savage and insatiable brutes which once inhabited it were no longer at large. The day's exploration was not over. Continuing his journey, he came upon and shot a fine zebra, his first. By the time it was skinned, darkness was fast approaching, so they selected a suitable tree in which to pass the night. They built a goodly fire under it and roasted some quails he had shot. Then, he and Mahina betook themselves to the branches. Muta, however, was afraid of nothing and said he would sleep on the ground. He was not so full of courage later on. About midnight, a great rhino passed their way, winded them, and snorted so loudly that Muta scrambled in abject terror up their tree. He was as nimble as a monkey for all his stoutness, and never ceased climbing until he was far above them, much to the amusement of Mahina, who chaffed him unmercifully. Although the jungle around Tsavo was a network of rhino paths, Patterson had never so far been successful in his efforts to obtain one of these animals. His ambition was not yet to be realized. One day he found a broad and well-beaten rhino track and followed it, fully expecting to come face to face with one at every corner. He found a place where one had recently been rolling in the dust, a spot it evidently used regularly. He decided to spend a night in the overhanging branches of a nearby tree. The next afternoon, he and Mahina made their way back to the place, and by dusk they were safely but uncomfortably perched among the branches directly over the path. They had scarcely been there an hour when, to their delight, they heard a great rhino plodding along the track in their direction. Unfortunately, the moon had not yet risen, and it was too dark to see the monster as it approached. He knew, however, that there would be just enough light for him to see it when it emerged from the bushes into the little clearing at the foot of their tree. Nearer and nearer they heard it coming steadily on, and he had his rifle ready. But just at that moment, the wind veered round and blew straight from them towards the rhino. The great beast scented them immediately, gave a mighty snort, and then dived madly away through the jungle. For a considerable time they could hear it crashing ponderously through everything that came in its way. They neither heard nor saw anything more of it, and spent a wakeful and uncomfortable night for nothing. Some months later, on the banks of the Sabaki, he had another attempt. He and Mahina were perched in a tree near the river, watching the moonlit landscape. First, a waterbuck came to drink, then a bushbuck, then a tiny paa, which was in turn stalked by a jackal. But the jackal suddenly stopped and fled, and Patterson looked round to discover the cause. To his surprise, he saw a large and very beautiful leopard, crouching down and moving noiselessly in the direction of their tree. At first he thought it must be stalking some animal on the ground below them, but he soon realized that it was Mahina, who was dozing in a lower fork of the tree, that the brute was intent on. Whether the leopard would actually have sprung at his, Sleeping gun-bearer, Patterson did not know, but he had no intention of letting him have the chance. He cautiously raised his rifle, but absolutely noiseless. As he was in doing this, the leopard noticed it. Perhaps a glint of moonlight on the barrel caught its eye, and it immediately disappeared into the bush before he could get in a shot. A long time after this, the quarry he had hoped for finally made his appearance. Through an opening in the elephant grass that lined the river's edge, a huge black mass emerged, a rhino, making its way very leisurely out of the shallow water. On he came with a slow, ponderous tread. Almost directly beneath them, he halted and stood for an instant, clearly exposed. This was Patterson's opportunity. He took careful aim at the beast's shoulder and fired. Instantly, and with extraordinary rapidity, the huge beast whirled round like a peg top, whereupon Patterson fired again. This time, he expected him to fall, but instead, he had the mortification of seeing the rhino rush off into the jungle, crashing through it like a great steamroller. He consoled himself by thinking that the beast was hard hit and that he would easily find him when daylight arrived, but once again, the hunt proved fruitless. The next morning, they followed a clear blood trail for a couple of miles, but it eventually got fainter and ceased altogether on rocky ground, and they had to abandon the search. Rhinos, he was learning, were extraordinary animals, not in any way to be depended upon. One day they would flee from a human, the next they might execute a most determined and deadly charge. His chance to finally secure one of these great beasts, and his most terrifying encounter with one, would come later, after his work at Tsavo was finished. In March of 1899, he received instructions to proceed to Railhead and take charge of a section of the work there. He was sorry to say goodbye to Tsavo, where he had spent such an eventful year, but he was glad of the new post. Railhead had reached a place called Machakos Road, some 276 miles from Mombasa, on the edge of the great treeless Athi Plains. Here, the country was entirely different. Instead of the dense, thorny nyika, he could see for miles across stretches of beautiful open downs timbered here and there like an English park. His instructions were to hurry on the construction of the line as fast as possible to Nairobi, some 50 miles further on. He made it his custom to take a walk each morning for some distance ahead of the rails, to spy out the land and estimate the materials that would be required. About 10 days after his arrival at Machakos Road, he walked in this way for 5 or 6 miles ahead of the last laid rail. It was rather unusual for him to go so far, and as it happened, he was alone on this occasion, his gun-bearer having been left behind in camp. About 2 miles away on his left, he noticed a dark-looking object, and thinking it was an ostrich, he started off towards it. Very soon, however, he found that it was bigger game than an ostrich. On getting still nearer, he made out the form of a great rhinoceros lying down. He continued to advance very cautiously, wriggling through the short grass until at length he got within 50 yards of where the huge beast was resting. Here he lay and watched him. But after some little time, the rhino evidently suspected his presence, for it rose to its feet, looked straight in his direction, and then proceeded to walk around him in a half-circle. The moment the great beast got his wind, it whipped round in its tracks like a cat and came for him in a dead straight, furious charge. Hoping to turn him, Patterson fired instantly, but his soft-nosed bullets merely annoyed the beast further and had not the slightest effect on its thick hide. Seeing this, he flung himself down, quite flat on the grass, and threw his helmet some 10 feet away in the hope that the rhino would perceive it and vent its rage on it instead of on him. On he thundered, while Patterson scarcely dared to breathe. He could hear the rhino snorting and rooting up the grass quite close to him, but luckily for him, it did not catch sight of his prone form and charged by, a few yards to his left. As soon as it had passed, his courage began to revive again, and he could not resist the temptation of sending a couple of bullets after him. These, however, simply cracked against the rhino's hide and splintered to pieces, sending the dry mud off in little clouds of dust. Their only real effect was to make the beast even more angry. It stood stock still for a moment, gored the ground most viciously, and then started off once more on the semicircle around him. This proceeding terrified Patterson more than ever, as he felt sure that the rhino would come upwind at him again, and he could scarcely hope to escape a second time. Unfortunately, his surmise proved correct. Directly the rhino scented him, up went its nose in the air, and down it charged like a battering ram. Patterson fairly pressed himself into the ground as flat as ever he could. He felt the thud of its great feet pounding the earth, yet dared not move or look up lest it should see him. His heart was thumping like a steam hammer, and every moment he fully expected to find himself tossed into the air. Nearer and nearer came the heavy thudding, and he had quite given himself up for lost, when from his lying position he caught sight, out of the corner of his eye, of the infuriated beast rushing by. He had missed him again. Patterson never felt so relieved in his life, and assuredly did not attempt to annoy him further. He watched it disappear into the distance, amazed at how rapidly such a huge, ungainly-looking brute could move, turning and twisting in its tracks just like a monkey. His first successful rhino hunt came shortly after this incident. When he was out with Dr. Brock, they spotted 2 rhinos in a hollow and stalked them carefully, keeping about 50 yards apart in case of a charge. They managed to get within about 60 yards of them, and as it was Patterson's turn for a shot, he took aim at the larger of the 2. Just as it decided to charge Dr. Brock, it gave Patterson the chance he had been waiting for. He fired instantly at the hollow between the neck and shoulder. The brute dropped at once, and save for 1 or 2 convulsive kicks of its stumpy legs, it never moved again. The second rhino, a well-grown youngster, showed considerable fight as they attempted to approach its fallen comrade, and it took them about 2 hours of shouting and throwing stones before they finally succeeded in driving it away. The trophy, he felt, was well worth the pains and the terror he had taken to add it to his collection. The demons of the wild came in many forms, and the fury of the rhino was a terror all its own. Shortly after the death of the second man-eater, with the Tsavo bridge standing strong and work in the valley complete, Colonel Patterson received new orders. He was to proceed to the advancing front of the railway, to railhead, and take charge of the plate laying across the Great Plains. He left Tsavo, a place of such trial and terror, with mixed feelings, but was eager for the change of scene and the new challenges that lay ahead. The train journey took him away from the sun-baked valley and up into the highlands, the character of the country changing dramatically. The dense, thorny wilderness gave way to fairly open and interesting country, and finally he arrived at Machacos Road, some 276 miles from the coast. Here, he had reached the edge of a new world, the Kapiti and Athi Plains. This was a land utterly different from the claustrophobic jungle of Tsavo. It was a great, endless tract of rolling downs, a sea of grass that stretched to the horizon, dotted here and there with a few stunted trees that struggled for life along the banks of dry ravines. The air here, at an altitude of over 4,000 feet, was fresh and cool, a welcome relief from the oppressive heat he had grown accustomed to. But the most striking feature of these undulating plains, the one which gave them a never-failing interest, was the staggering abundance of game. It was a living museum of African wildlife. Here, Patterson himself saw lion, rhinoceros, leopard, eland, giraffe, zebra, wildebeest, hartebeest, waterbuck, warthog, and great varieties of gazelle, including Grant's and Thompson's son. The air was filled with ostriches, bustards, and a host of other birds, too. At the time, these plains were also the principal grazing ground for the immense herds of cattle owned by the proud and warlike Maasai people. Patterson's new task was to push the railway line across this expanse to a place called Nairobi, some 50 miles further on, which was to become the headquarters of the Railway Administration for. Plate laying was fascinating work, a process that had to move with the precision of clockwork. First came the earthworkers, preparing the surface, making cuttings through rises and building up banks across hollows. Then came a line of coolies, dropping wooden sleepers at regular intervals. They were followed by another gang, who laid the heavy steel rails in their places, and yet another that brought along the keys, fish plates, bolts, and nuts. Behind them came the men who fixed the rails to the sleepers, and finally, the packing gang, who filled in earth and ballast to give the track its necessary grip and rigidity. On good days, they might lay over a mile of track. On difficult terrain, only a few yards. The greatest difficulty they had to contend with while crossing this dry expanse was the provision of sufficient water for the 3,000 workmen employed at Railhead 5. For a stretch of nearly 50 miles, there was not a single drop of water to be obtained, save for a few hidden water holes known only to the wild animals. Any breakdown in the supply would have had the most disastrous consequences for so large a body of men working all day under the blazing tropical sun. Every day, 2 trainloads of water in great iron tanks were brought up from the last stream they had passed, which, of course, fell further and further to the rear with each passing day 6. This caused considerable delays, as the single line was blocked while the water was being pumped into the tanks, and no construction material could come through. At first, Patterson had most of the tank filling done by night, but on one occasion, a lion came unpleasantly close to the men working the pump, and so night work had to be abandoned. So anxious were the coolies for water that once or twice, some of the more daring spirits among them ventured out onto the plains in search of the secret water holes. Their expeditions had a tragic end. 3 of these men never returned, and what befell them is not known to this date. One day, as Patterson was contending with this constant and frustrating delay, a native appeared at his tent door. He was a lean, withered man, a half-bred Maasai, with nothing by way of dress but a small piece of cowhide thrown over his left shoulder. He squatted down on his heels in the native fashion and, after the proper salutations, said, "I have heard that the great master wants water. I can show it to him." This was good news, if it could be relied upon. The man explained that some time previously he had been in the locality on a raiding expedition and had found water. When Patterson asked if the place was far away, he got the standard, frustrating reply, "Mbali Kidogo, a little distance." Patterson had had experience of Mbali Kidogo before. It was like an Irishman's mile and a bit, an elastic measurement that could mean anything. Nevertheless, he decided to start very early the next morning on a search for this pond. The Maasai guide, whose name was Lungau, led them confidently across the rolling plains. The march was full of interest, for on the way they passed within easy range of great herds of wildebeest, hartebeest, gazelle, and zebra. Patterson, however, was out strictly on business and did not attempt a shot. Late in the forenoon, they arrived at Lungau's pond, a circular dip in the ground, about 80 yards in diameter, which had, without doubt, contained water, very recently, but which, as Patterson had half expected, was now quite dry, its cracked mud floor littered with the bones of animals. The guide appeared very much upset when he saw the empty pond and gave vent to many exclamations in his peculiar language. Their search for water having thus proved a failure, Patterson determined to try his luck with the game. He sent the guide back to camp, while he and Mahina made a big detour. The animals, however, were now much more shy than they had been in the morning, and for several miles his stalks proved fruitless. He was beginning to think they would have to return empty-handed when he saw a herd of wildebeest and, with much care, managed to get within 300 yards of them. He singled out the biggest head and, at his shot, the great beast dropped at once. He ran up to the fallen animal, which appeared to be dying, and told Mahina to put it quickly out of its pain with a hunting knife. As Mahina was struggling to pierce the tough hide, Patterson handed him his rifle and took the knife to do it himself. Just as he raised the knife to strike, he was startled to see the wildebeest suddenly jump to its feet. For a moment it stood looking at him in a dazed, tottery kind of way, and then, to his amazement, it turned and made off. At first it staggered with such an uncertain gait that he felt confident it could only go a few yards before dropping, but after about 60 yards, it seemed to revive suddenly, broke into its ordinary gallop, and quickly rejoined the herd, disappearing from view 13. The wildebeest, he learned, was a creature that often shammed dead. His friend Rawson, about this time, had a very similar experience with a more serious result. He had knocked his wildebeest over and, thinking it was dead, proceeded to set up his stand camera to take a photograph of its head. Just as he was about to take the picture, he was thunderstruck to see the animal jump up and come charging down upon him. He sprang quickly aside, and in an instant, his camera went flying into the air, followed the next moment by his unfortunate Indian servant, the wildebeest, having stuck its horn right through the man's thigh and tossed him over its back. 14. Fortunately, the brute fell dead after this final effort. After abandoning the chase of his own revived wildebeest, Patterson and Mahina were making their way back towards camp when he thought he observed something of a reddish color moving in a patch of long grass a good distance away. He asked Mahina what he could make of it, but before he could get his field glasses to bear, the animal, whatever it was, had disappeared. He kept his eye on the spot, however, and they gradually approached it. When they were about 100 yards off, the reddish object again appeared. He saw that it was nothing less than the shaggy head of a lion peeping over the long grass. Mahina saw it too, and exclaimed, "Dekho, Sahib, sure? Look, master, a lion!" Patterson whispered to him to be quiet and to take no notice, while he tried his best to follow his own advice. They kept on, edging up towards the beast, but apparently oblivious of its presence, as it lay there grimly watching them. As they drew nearer, Patterson asked Mahina in a whisper if he felt equal to facing a charge from the shur if he should wound him. Mahina answered simply that where Patterson went, there would he go also, and, as events would prove, he would right well keep his word. Patterson watched the lion carefully out of the corner of his eye as they closed in. Every now and then it would disappear from view for a moment, and it was a fascinating sight to see how it slowly raised its massive head above the top of the grass again and gazed calmly and steadily at them as they neared him. He could not distinguish the outline of its body, hidden as it was in the grassy thicket, so he circled cautiously round in order to see if the cover was thinner at the back, but as he moved, the lion also twisted round, always keeping its head facing them. They were now within 70 yards of the lion, who was beginning to lose the sleepy look with which he had at first regarded them, and was now fully on the alert. Patterson, however, was bent on war. In a standing position, he took careful aim at the great head and fired. The distance was a bare 70 yards, yet he confessed to a disgraceful miss. More astonishing still, the beast made not the slightest movement. It did not even blink an eye, so far as he could see, but continued its steadfast, questioning gaze. He took aim again, this time for a spot below the tip of its nose, and again he fired. This time he was more successful. The lion turned a complete somersault over its tail. He thought it was done for, but it instantly sprang to its feet again, and to his horror and astonishment, it was joined by a lioness, whose presence they had never even thought of, or Suspected 13. Worse was still to follow, for to their dismay, both lions made a most determined charge on them, bounding along at a great pace and roaring angrily as they came. Poor Mahina cried out, "Sahib Dusharatahai! Master, 2 lions are coming," but Patterson told him to stand stock still and for his life not to make the slightest movement. In the twinkling of an eye, the 2 beasts had covered about 40 yards of the distance towards them. As they did not show the least sign of stopping, Patterson thought they had given the experiment of remaining absolutely motionless a fair trial, and was just about to raise his rifle as a last resort when suddenly the wounded lion stopped, staggered, and fell to the ground. The lioness took a couple of bounds nearer to them, and then, to his unmeasured relief, turned to look round for her mate, who had by this time managed to get to his feet again. There they both stood, growling viciously and lashing their tails for what appeared to be a succession of ages. The lioness then made up her mind to go back to the lion, and they both stood broadside on, their heads close together, snarling in a most aggressive manner. Just at this juncture, the lion seemed to grow suddenly very weak. He staggered some 10 yards back towards his lair, and then fell to the ground. The lioness followed and lay down beside him, both still watching Patterson and growling savagely. After a few seconds, the lion struggled to his feet again and retreated a little further, the lioness accompanying him, until he fell once more. This happened a 3rd time, and at last, Patterson began to breathe more freely as they had now reached the thicket from which they had originally emerged. He took a shot at the lioness as she lay beside her mate, but he did not think he hit her. In any case, she at once made off, bounding away at a great rate. He sent a few bullets after her to speed her on her way, and then cautiously approached the wounded lion. It was stretched out at full length on its side, and he could see by the heaving of its flanks that it was not yet dead, so he put a bullet through its spine 21. It never moved after this. He and Mahina stood over the great beast, admiring its fine head and long, clean tusks. While Mahina went in search of natives to help carry the skin back to camp, Patterson took a good look around the place and found the half-eaten body of a zebra. He also swept the plain with his glasses and discovered the lioness, about a mile away, apparently lying down in the midst of a herd of hartebeest, who grazed away without taking any notice of her. He was much inclined to follow her up, but he was afraid that the vultures already circling overhead would settle on his lion and spoil the skin. The destruction which these ravenous birds are capable of, even in the space of only a few minutes, is almost beyond belief. He waited impatiently for Mahina's return, feeling acutely the nerve-shattering experience of remaining absolutely alone for hours on a vast open plain beside the carcass of a dead lion, with vultures wheeling incessantly overhead. It was a great relief when Mahina finally appeared with half a dozen natives in his train, and they made their way back to camp, arriving just at sundown. A few days after this adventure, as the railway pushed further across the plains, a great caravan of some 4,000 men arrived from the interior. They were mostly Basoga porters, bringing luggage and food for a Sikh regiment that was on its way down to the coast after suppressing a mutiny in Uganda 22. None of these men from the heart of Africa had ever seen or heard of a railway, and they displayed the liveliest curiosity, crowding round one of the engines, hazarding the wildest guesses as to its origin and use. Patterson thought he would provide a little entertainment for them. He stepped onto the footplate and blew off the steam, at the same time sounding the whistle 23. The effect was magical. The whole crowd first threw themselves flat on the ground, howling with fear, and then, with heads down and arms spread out, they fled wildly in all directions, not stopping until he shut off the steam 24. Just after this caravan had moved on, torrential rainstorms transformed the whole plain into a quaking bog, stopping all railway work. The black subsoil became a mass of thick mud, and innocent-looking dry gullies or dongas became roaring torrents in an incredibly short time. It was during this period that Patterson decided to try and capture a zebra alive. He selected a dozen fleet-footed Indians, and, using the boggy ground to their advantage, they managed to surround a herd and run some of the younger ones to an absolute standstill. They captured no less than 6 in this way, though they were very wild and fractious 25. Patterson kept 3 for himself, one of which, a sturdy 2-year-old, he managed to tame. It became quite domesticated, but one afternoon, on hearing a wild herd gallop by, it was so excited that it tore its picketing peg out of the ground and galloped off to rejoin its brethren in Freedom 26. Some days later, the great caravan of Basoga porters returned from the coast on their way back to their own country. But alas, what a terrible difference there was in their appearance. All their gaiety and light-heartedness was gone. The poor fellows were in a pitiable state. A frightful epidemic of dysentery had broken out amongst them, likely caused by their eating food at the coast to which they were entirely unaccustomed. The ranks of the caravan were terribly decimated, and dozens of men were left dead or dying along the roadside after each march. It was a case of the survival of the fittest, as it was impossible for the whole caravan to halt in the waterless wilderness. There was only one European with the party, and he could do very little among such a number. 13 poor wretches fell out to die close to Patterson's tent. They were in the most hopeless condition, far too weak to do anything for themselves. Patterson immediately boiled a bucketful of water, added tins of condensed milk and a good portion of a bottle of brandy, and fed them the mixture 28. Their feeble cries for some of this nourishment were heart-rending. 6 proved to be beyond all help and died that night, but the remaining 7 he managed to nurse back to complete recovery over the next fortnight 29. The day after he first found these stricken natives, Patterson had to ride ahead of the railway to make arrangements for a temporary bridge over the stony Athi River. His road lay along the route taken by the home-returning caravan, and every 100 yards or so he passed the swollen corpse of some unfortunate porter who had fallen out and died by the wayside 30. Before long, he came up with the rear guard of this straggling, dying army, and here he was witness to as unfeeling an act of barbarism as can well be imagined. A poor wretch, utterly unable to go a step further, had rolled himself up in his scarlet blanket to lie down and die, whereupon one of his companions, coveting the highly prized article, turned back, seized one end of the blanket, and callously rolled the dying man out of it as one would unroll a bale of goods 31. This was too much for Patterson. He spurred his pony, galloped up to the scoundrel, and made as if to thrash him with his rhino-hide whip. The man put his hand on his knife, but on seeing Patterson dismount and point his rifle at him, he desisted. Patterson made it clear by signs that he would fire if the man did not at once go back and replace the blanket around his dying comrade. This he eventually did, sullenly enough, and Patterson then marched him in front of him to the main camp and handed him over to the officer in charge, who had him soundly thrashed for his brutality. 32. After this grim duty, Patterson pushed on. He shot a fine Grant's gazelle, and scarcely had it dropped when the few Basoga who had followed him swooped down on it, ripped it open, and devoured huge chunks of the raw, still quivering flesh, lapping up the warm blood in the palms of their hands. On his return journey the next day, he had to pass the camp which the caravan had just left. The spectacle of about a dozen newly made graves, which hyenas had already torn open, caused him to put spurs to his horse and gallop as fast as possible through the pestilential spot 34. Life on the plains continued in this vein, a constant oscillation between the methodical work of engineering and the wild, unpredictable, and often brutal realities of life and death in the African wilderness. As Railhead reached the Athi River itself, Patterson's duties involved surveying the site for yet another temporary bridge. It was here, while engaged in this work, that he would have another series of thrilling encounters with the undisputed king of these great plains, the African lion. As the railway pushed beyond the valley of the Tsavo and onto the great, rolling Athi plains, Patterson found himself in a new and fascinating world. This was the domain of the Maasai, a people whose very name was once a source of terror for every other tribe in East Africa. Formerly the most powerful native race in the region, their numbers had been greatly reduced by famine and smallpox, but the remnant of the tribe, especially the men, were still a fine, lithe, clean-limbed people of remarkable presence. While stationed on the plains, Patterson managed to have an interview with their great chief, the Laban, a man named Lanana, at one of his royal residences, which was a large kraal near the site of what would become the town of Nairobi. Lanana was affability itself, presenting Patterson with a spear and shield as a memento of the occasion. But Patterson found him to be a most wily old potentate. Whenever he was asked an awkward question, he would simply nudge his prime minister and command him to answer for him. Patterson persuaded the chief and his wives and children to sit for a photograph, and also got Lanana's nephew and another warrior to engage in mock combat with their long, keen spears and buffalo hide shields. He learned much about their wonderfully well-organized military system. The warriors of the tribe, the Elmorani, had to attend strictly to their duties and were not allowed to marry, smoke, or drink alcohol until after their term of active service was completed. They carried the great spear and shield, and often a short sword called a simi, or a heavy club called a knobkerrie, suspended from a raw hide waist belt. In their weird, feathered headdresses, they looked ferocious indeed. Before the arrival of British rule, sudden raids were constantly being made by them on the weaker tribes. When a kraal was captured, all the male defenders were instantly killed with the spear, while the women and children were put to death with clubs. The Maasai never made slaves or took prisoners. It was their proud and terrible boast that where a party of Elmorani had passed, nothing of any kind was left alive. The object of these raids was always to capture livestock, for the Maasai were not an agricultural people. Their wealth consisted entirely of their herds of cattle, sheep, and goats. Curiously, they did not hunt the game that abounded in their country, but lived principally on beef and milk. It was also a common custom for them to drink daily a pint or so of blood, drawn from the neck of a live bullock with a special blocked arrow that pierced the vein without killing the animal. Because they lived entirely on cattle, and cattle could not thrive without good pasture, they had a great and profound reverence for grass. They also worshipped a supreme being whom they called Nagai. But this term was also applied to anything which was beyond their understanding, like the sky or rain. Perhaps the most curious of their customs was the extraction of the two central incisor teeth from the lower jaw. It was said that this habit originated at a time when lockjaw was very prevalent among the tribe, and it was found that if these teeth were pulled out, liquid food could still be poured into a patient's mouth. Whatever the reason for the custom, the absence of these two teeth constituted a most distinctive identifying mark. Patterson remembered once being out with a Maasai guide when they came across the bleached skull of a long-defunct member of his tribe, easily recognizable as such. The guide at once plucked a handful of grass, spat upon it, and then placed it very carefully within the skull, explaining that this was done to avert evil from himself. This same man asked Patterson, among many other questions, if his country was nearer to God than the Maasai's. Patterson confessed he was unable, conscientiously, to answer him in the affirmative. He learned of their other customs, how they used to spit in a person's face as a mark of great friendship, a tradition they were now abandoning in favor of the English handshake. He saw how they distorted the lobes of their ears, stretching them until they hung down 5 or 6 inches, pierced and decorated with large pieces of wood, tin canisters, or bunches of beads and chains. The women, especially, were fond of covering their limbs with great heavy coils of iron or copper wire. A woman's social standing was judged by the quantity of wire she wore. As a rule, the Maasai did not bury their dead, considering the practice to be prejudicial to the soil. The bodies were simply carried a little distance from the village and left to be devoured by hyenas and vultures. The honor of burial was reserved only for a great chief, over whose remains a large mound would be raised. Patterson found them to be, in general, an upright and honorable savage race, and he thought it a great pity that they were, even then, gradually dying out. He also encountered other tribes, like the Dabwandarobo, a shy race of hunters who were more or less serfs of the Maasai, and the Wa-Kikuyu, who inhabited the region around Nairobi. The Wa-Kikuyu had a reputation for being cowardly and treacherous, and Patterson knew this to be true in some cases. His friend, Captain Haslam, the same man who had accompanied him to see the remains of the first man-eater victim, Ungun Singh, had been barbarously murdered by members of this tribe. Haslam had been in charge of transport and had made it his custom to dissect the bodies of animals that died from disease in order to study their afflictions. The superstitious Wa-Kikuyu became fully convinced that by this he was bewitching their own cattle, which at the time were dying in scores from rinderpest. And so, instigated no doubt by their witch doctor, they treacherously killed him. Patterson, however, had a different experience. He employed about 400 Wa-Kikuyu to work at Nairobi and never had any trouble with them, finding them well-behaved, intelligent, and most anxious to learn. As was the custom with nearly all African races, the women of the Wa-Kikuyu did the manual labor of the village and carried the heavy loads for their lords and masters, the great bundles held in position on their backs by a strap passing around their foreheads. During this time, while the railway forged ahead, the hunting adventures continued. One day, Patterson's friend, Spooner, the district engineer, joined him for a shoot. The two men often had friendly arguments regarding the comparative courage of the lion and the tiger, Spooner holding the view that Stripes was the more formidable foe, while Patterson, from his own lively personal experience, maintained that a lion, when once roused, was unequaled for pluck and daring. He believed that Spooner would eventually come around to his opinion. He could never have guessed that his friend's conversion would take place the very next day, in the most melancholy and tragic manner imaginable. They set off in Spooner's tonga, a 2-wheeled cart, accompanied by Spooner's trusted Indian shikari, Buddha, Patterson's gun-bearer Mahina, and another servant. After some time, they spotted a very fine lion and a lioness. A long and exciting chase ensued, first on foot, then a wild, bumpy ride in the tonga to cut off the lion's retreat. They eventually managed to wound the lioness, but she escaped into some long grass, and they decided to leave her and come back the next day. As they were returning to camp, Patterson, who was riding ahead on a spare horse, was startled to see 2 more fine lions not more than 100 yards away. Spooner whipped up the ponies and was beside him in a moment. They dismounted and began a cautious advance on the 2 crouching beasts, arranging that Spooner would take the right-hand one and Patterson the other. At 60 yards, the lions suddenly turned and bolted. Patterson managed to put a bullet into the one he had marked just as it crested a bank, and it reared up, clawing the air. He galloped after them on his horse, and finding they could not escape, the 2 lions turned and came to bay, charging down upon him. He had no rifle, so he turned and fled, the lions giving up the chase when they saw they could not overtake him. When Spooner came up with the rifles, they renewed the attack. Patterson first fired at the unhurt lion at long range, and it sprang into the air, seemingly badly hit. They then turned their attention to the nearer lion, the one he had wounded first. Spooner sat down comfortably at 90 yards and knocked it over quite dead with a single shot from his heavy .577 rifle. It was now dusk, and there was no time to be lost if they meant to bag the second lion as well. They resumed their advance, the lion twisting round in the grass to keep facing them, growling savagely and lashing its tail against the ground, raising a cloud of dust. They got to within 80 yards. Patterson about 5 yards to the left of Spooner, and the shikari Buddha a similar distance to Spooner's right rear. The lion was now beside itself with fury. Patterson, knowing it was high time they did something, asked Spooner to fire. He dropped to one knee and waited. The moment Spooner's shot rang out, the lion jumped up and charged down in a dead straight line for Patterson, coming in long, low bounds at a tremendous speed. Patterson fired his right barrel at about 50 yards, but apparently missed. He fired the left at about half that range, still with no stopping effect. He knew then that there was no time to reload, so he remained kneeling, expecting the great beast to be on him the very next moment. Suddenly, just as the lion was within a single bound of him, it made a quick turn to his right. Good heavens, Patterson thought. He is going for Spooner. He was wrong. The lion flashed past Spooner as well, and with a last, tremendous bound, it seized the unfortunate shikari, Buddha, by the leg, and rolled over and over with him in the impetus of the rush. Finally, it stood over the man's prostrate body and tried to seize him by the throat. The brave fellow prevented this by courageously stuffing his left arm right into the great, gaping jaws. By moving at the critical moment, poor Buddha had diverted the lion's attention from Patterson and had drawn the whole fury of the charge onto himself. All this happened in only a second or two. Spooner rushed in and actually put his left hand on the lion's flank, trying in vain to push the beast off Buddha's body. The lion, however, was so busily engaged in mauling Buddha's arm that it paid no attention. Patterson, meanwhile, had had a fresh cartridge thrust into his hand by another servant, and he rushed to the rescue. As he came up, the lion stopped chewing the arm, though still holding it in its mouth, and threw itself back on its haunches, preparing for a spring at Patterson, its lips curled back in a savage snarl. He knew he had not a moment to spare. He threw the rifle to his shoulder and pulled the trigger. To his utter despair and horror, it did not go off. Misfire again, he thought, and his heart almost stopped beating. He took a step backwards, feeling it was all over now. But as he took his third step back, just as the brute was gathering itself for its spring, it suddenly struck him that in his haste and excitement, he had forgotten that he was using a borrowed rifle and had not pulled back the external hammer. To do this and put a bullet through the lion's brain was then the work of a moment. The great beast fell dead instantly, right on top of Buddha. They rolled the great carcass off the wounded man and forced open the jaws to disengage the mangled arm. Poor Buddha's left arm and right leg were both frightfully mauled, the latter being broken as well. He was lifted tenderly into the tonga, and Spooner set off with him to camp and the doctor. The old shikari bore his terrible injuries with wonderful cheerfulness, speaking of the revenge he would have on the whole tribe of lions as soon as he was able to get about again. But alas, his hunting days were over. His leg got rapidly worse, and mortification set in. The leg had to be amputated halfway up the thigh. The operation, performed by a Dr. Winston Waters, was skillful, and curiously, the operating table was canopied with the skin of the very lion that had been responsible for the injury. Buddha made a good recovery from the operation, but seemed to lose heart when he found he had only one leg left, as according to his ideas, he now had but a poor chance of being allowed to enter heaven. To the great sorrow of Patterson and Spooner, who had looked after him like a brother, he sank gradually and died some weeks later. The death of Buddha was a grim reminder of the stakes involved in hunting such dangerous game. But an even more shocking and bizarre tragedy involving a man-eating lion was still to occur, a story that would become almost as famous as that of the Tsavo man-eaters themselves. Towards the end of Patterson's stay in East Africa, a new man-eater had taken up its quarters at a little roadside station called Kima. This lion was a most daring brute, with an extraordinary taste for the members of the railway staff. One night, in his efforts to obtain a meal, he actually climbed up onto the roof of the station building and tried to tear off the corrugated iron sheets. The terrified telegraph operator below sent a now famous laconic message to the traffic manager, lion fighting with station. "Send urgent succor." On that occasion, the lion was not victorious, but it cut its feet badly on the iron sheeting, leaving large bloodstains on the roof. Soon after, however, it succeeded in carrying off the native driver of the pumping engine and added several other victims to its list. It was in a vain attempt to destroy this pest that a man named Ryall, the superintendent of the police, met his tragic and untimely end. On June 6, 1900, Ryall was traveling up in his personal inspection carriage, accompanied by two friends, a German named Hübner and an Italian named Parenti. When they reached Kima, they were told that the man-eater had been seen close to the station only a short time before their train arrived, so they at once made up their minds to remain there for the night and try to shoot him. Ryall's carriage was detached from the train and shunted into a siding, where, owing to the unfinished state of the line, it did not stand perfectly level, but had a pronounced list to one side. After an unsuccessful look for the lion in the afternoon, they returned to the carriage for dinner. Afterwards, they all sat up on guard for some time. The only noticeable thing they saw was what they took to be two very bright and steady glowworms. After events proved that these could have been nothing else than the eyes of the man-eater, steadily watching them, studying their every movement. The hour growing late, Ryall persuaded his two friends to lie down while he kept the first watch. Hübner occupied a high berth on one side of the carriage, while Parenti, declining the lower berth, made himself comfortable on the floor, his feet towards the sliding door that gave admission to the carriage. It is supposed that Ryall, after watching for a considerable time, must have come to the conclusion that the lion was not going to make its appearance that night, for he lay down on the lower berth and dozed off. No sooner had he done so, doubtless, than the cunning man-eater began its stalk. It mounted the two very high steps from the railway line to the small platform at the end of the carriage, silently and successfully. The door from this platform into. The carriage was a sliding one on wheels, which ran very easily on a brass runner. As it was probably not quite shut, it was an easy matter for the lion to thrust in a paw and shove it open. But here, a fatal mechanism came into play. Owing to the tilt of the carriage and the lion's great extra weight on that side, the moment the beast got its body right, inside, the door slid shut behind it and snapped into the lock, trapping the great predator inside the small compartment with the three sleeping men. The lion sprang at once at Ryall, but in order to reach him, it had to plant its feet on Parenti, who was sleeping on the floor. At this moment, Hübner was suddenly awakened by a loud cry. He looked down from his high berth and was horrified to see an enormous lion standing with its hind feet on Parenti's body, while its forepaws rested on poor Ryall. Small wonder that he was panic-stricken at the sight. There was only one possible way of escape, through the second sliding door communicating with the servants' quarters at the opposite end of the compartment. But in order to reach this door, Hübner had to literally jump onto the man-eater's back, for its great bulk filled up all the space beneath his berth. It sounds scarcely credible, but in the excitement and horror of the moment, he actually did this. Fortunately, the lion was too busily engaged with its victim to pay any attention to him. He managed to reach the door in safety, but there, to his dismay, he found that it was being held fast on the other side by the terrified coolies, who had been aroused by the disturbance. In utter desperation, he made frantic efforts to open it and, exerting all his strength, at last managed to pull it back sufficiently far to allow him to squeeze through, whereupon the trembling coolies instantly tied it up again with their turbans. A moment afterwards, a great crash was heard, and the whole carriage lurched violently to one side. The lion had broken through one of the windows, carrying off poor Ryall with him. Parenti, now released, lost no time in jumping through the window on the opposite side and fleeing for refuge to the station buildings. His escape was nothing short of miraculous. Ryall's remains were found the next morning, about a quarter of a mile away in the bush. The terrible brute responsible for this awful tragedy was caught a short time later in an ingenious trap. He was kept on view for several days, a spectacle of demonic power, and then shot. Patterson's time in Africa was drawing to a close, but the continent had one last, remarkable discovery in store for him. He left the railway in late 1899, but returned in 1906 on a shooting trip. It was on this trip, on the Laikipia Plateau, that he shot a magnificent old bull eland. Upon examining the head and skin carefully, he found that they both differed materially from those of any other eland he had ever seen. For one thing, there was no long tuft of hair on the forehead, and from the lower corner of each eye ran an incomplete white stripe, similar to that found in the giant eland of West Africa. On his return to England, he sent the head to the famous taxidermist Rowland Ward to be set up. While there, it was seen by Mr. R. Lydecker of the British Museum, a renowned naturalist. Lydekker wrote to Patterson to tell him that his trophy possessed great zoological interest, as it showed the existence of a hitherto unknown race of eland. This new subspecies was officially designated Taratragus oryx pattersonianus in honor of its discoverer. Patterson gladly presented the head to the British Museum, where it remains to this day. Soon after his first tour of duty, Patterson prepared to leave for England. A few days before he started, his 400 Wa Kikuyu children, as they called themselves, came to him in a body and begged to be taken with him. He pictured to them the cold, wet climate of England and its great distance, but they assured him they only wished to continue as his children and to go wherever he went. He could hardly imagine himself arriving in London with a bodyguard of 400 more or less naked tribesmen, and it was only with difficulty that he persuaded them to remain in their own country. His most faithful followers, Mahina, the brave gun-bearer, Roshan Khan, the boy whose life he had saved in that terrifying lion charge, and his honest watchman Mian, accompanied him to the coast, where they bade him a sorrowful farewell. So ended Patterson's first great chapter in Africa. He had arrived as an engineer, a builder for an empire. He left as a legend, a hunter of demons, a man who had stared into the very face of the savage soul of the wilderness and had not flinched. He had built his bridge of stone and steel, but he had also left behind a story that would outlast it, a story of terror, courage, and the epic, bloody battle between man and beast on the plains of Tsavo.